A forbidden romance leaves a wealthy woman with a secret she hides for years, until her butler's return threatens to expose everything. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The Harper Mansion's library stood as a testament to old money and tradition, its mahogany shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. Madison Harper moved between the shelves with practiced grace, her fingers trailing along leather-bound volumes. Elijah Bennett worked methodically nearby, his butler's uniform pristine as he reorganized a section of historical texts. Their eyes met across the room, a moment that lasted longer than propriety allowed. Madison grabbed a book at random, needing something to occupy her hands. She was acutely aware of Elijah's presence, the way he moved with quiet confidence despite his position as a servant. The library had become their sanctuary over the past months, a place where social boundaries seemed to blur within the confines of literature and learning. "That volume is excellent," Elijah said, noting the book in her hands, "though perhaps not what you're looking for." His voice carried the refined education that had initially caught Madison's attention, so at odds with his current station. She glanced down, realizing she held a treatise on agricultural practices. "Perhaps not," she admitted, replacing it on the shelf. Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same spot, sending an electric current through her arm. Weeks later, Madison sat in her private bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test with trembling hands. Positive. The words seemed to mock her, destroying the careful balance she'd maintained between her public life and private desires. She pressed a hand to her mouth, suppressing a sob that threatened to echo through the mansion's halls. Her first thought was to tell Elijah. He deserved to know, but the consequences loomed large in her mind. The Harper name carried weight in New York society, and a scandal involving a butler would destroy not only her reputation, but her family's standing. Her father's business partnerships, her mother's charitable works, all could crumble under the weight of such news. The annual Harper Foundation Gala provided the perfect cover for her carefully constructed lie. Madison stood at the top of the grand staircase, her emerald gown concealing her slight bump. She'd chosen her moment carefully, waiting until the perfect combination of sympathy and scandal would protect her secret. James would have been so proud, she heard someone whisper as she descended. Such a tragedy, losing him in that accident before he knew about the baby. James Crawford, her friend since childhood, had died in a boating accident 3 months prior. He'd never know she'd used his memory this way, creating a convenient father for her unborn child. Madison caught Elijah's eye across the ballroom, where he stood efficiently managing the serving staff. His face remained professionally blank, but she saw the pain in his eyes. The evening proceeded according to plan. Madison played her part perfectly, accepting condolences and sharing carefully edited stories about James. She touched her stomach at appropriate moments, letting tears gather in her eyes when people mentioned what a wonderful father he would have been. Elijah maintained his distance, serving champagne and managing the event with impeccable efficiency. But Madison noticed how his hands clenched slightly whenever someone mentioned James and the baby. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided looking directly at her. As the gala wound down, Madison retreated to a quiet corner of the ballroom. She watched Elijah direct the cleanup, his movements mechanical now, weighted with unspoken words. The lie had worked perhaps too well. She protected her family's reputation, secured her child's future in society, but the cost was written in every line of Elijah's body as he worked. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress. Madison pressed a hand to her stomach, wondering if she'd made the right choice. The glittering ballroom, the approving smiles of New York's elite, the carefully maintained facade of propriety. It all seemed hollow now, as empty as the champagne glasses being cleared away. Elijah's resignation letter sat on Madison's desk like a physical manifestation of their shared regrets. His handwriting, precise and educated, detailed his intention to pursue a law degree. Madison read it for the 10th time, her fingers tracing the words that marked the end of their shared secret. The morning he left, the mansion staff lined up to bid him farewell. Madison watched from her study window, one hand resting protectively over her growing belly. Elijah carried a single suitcase, everything he owned packed neatly inside. He didn't look up at her window, though she knew he must have felt her presence. His journey to law school proved challenging from the start. At Columbia University, Elijah faced raised eyebrows and whispered comments about his previous employment. During registration, the administrator looked at his paperwork with obvious skepticism. "A butler applying to law school?" the woman asked, peering over her glasses. "That's unusual. I've passed all entrance requirements," Elijah responded, his voice leveled despite the flush creeping up his neck. "My recommendations and test scores speak for themselves." Meanwhile, back at the Harper mansion, Madison navigated the complexities of motherhood under intense scrutiny. Oliver grew into a curious 4-year-old, his features a perfect blend of both parents, though nobody dared mention his resemblance to the former butler. "Mommy, what was my daddy like?" Oliver asked one evening, clutching a photograph of James Crawford that Madison kept on display. The question hit her like a physical blow. "He was very kind," she answered, recycling the same safe lie she'd been telling for years. "And he loved you very much." Each fabrication added another brick to the wall of deception she'd built around their lives. Oliver's questions grew more specific as he aged. He wanted to know about James's favorite color, his hobbies, whether he liked baseball. Madison created elaborate stories, weaving a tapestry of half-truths that threatened to suffocate her. During a quiet afternoon tea with her closest friend, Catherine Wells, Madison finally allowed her mask to crack. They sat in the mansion's solarium, surrounded by the exotic plants Madison used to discuss with Elijah. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Madison admitted, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer. "Every time Oliver asks about his father, I feel like I'm betraying them both." Catherine reached across the table to steady her friend's hand. "You did what you had to do to protect your family's position. The social consequences the social consequences," Madison interrupted bitterly. "Sometimes I wonder if they're worth the price we're all paying. Oliver deserves to know his real father, and Elijah." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "And what would happen then?" Catherine asked gently. How would Oliver handle learning that his father was a servant? How would society treat him? "Your protection extends beyond just your reputation, Madison." Madison stood, walking to the window. The afternoon sun highlighted the gardens where she and Elijah used to steal moments together, discussing literature and dreams. Now those same gardens felt like a museum of lost opportunities. "I've created this perfect life," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The respected widow, the devoted mother, the charitable socialite. Everyone tells me how well I've managed since James's death." She turned back to Catherine, her composure cracking. "But some nights, I lie awake wondering if I chose wrong. If I should have been brave enough to choose love over propriety." Catherine remained silent, understanding there was nothing she could say to ease her friend's burden. The choice had been made years ago, and its consequences would continue to ripple through their lives like stones thrown into a still pond. Outside, Oliver's laughter echoed from the garden where he played with his nanny. The sound carried a bitter sweetness, joy mixed with the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. Madison watched her son, seeing shadows of Elijah in his thoughtful expressions and quiet dignity, wondering if she'd sacrifice true happiness for the illusion of perfection. The New York Times headline read, "Rising Star in Civil Rights Law, Elijah Bennett's Remarkable Journey." The newspaper lay on Madison's breakfast table, his photograph staring up at her. 7 years had transformed him. The butler's uniform had been replaced by an expertly tailored suit, his posture now carrying natural authority rather than trained servitude. The article detailed his graduation at the top of his class from Columbia Law School, followed by a series of landmark cases defending victims of racial and class discrimination. He'd built a reputation as a fierce advocate for the underprivileged, turning down lucrative corporate offers to focus on social justice. Mr. Bennett's latest victory secured equal housing rights for service workers in Manhattan's elite neighborhoods. The article noted, a detail that made Madison's coffee taste suddenly bitter. Across town, in his modest but well-appointed office, Elijah reviewed case files with his team. His walls displayed not family photographs, but framed newspaper clippings documenting his legal victories. Each one represented another step away from his past life. Though thoughts of Madison and the child he suspected was his continued to haunt quiet moments. "Mr. Bennett," his secretary interrupted, "the Harper discrimination case file has arrived." The name caused him to pause mid-signature. "The Harper case?" "Yes, sir. A group of domestic workers is suing the Harper Foundation for discriminatory practices. Given your unique perspective on the family, the partners thought you'd be particularly suited to handle it." Meanwhile, Madison faced her own crisis. The whispers had started at her latest charity function. Rumors about Oliver's parentage, questions about the timeline of James's death and her pregnancy. A particularly bold Society columnist had begun asking uncomfortable questions about former staff members. Mrs. Harper, her public relations manager, addressed her in her study. "We need to address these rumors immediately. Several journalists are investigating your late husband's whereabouts during the time of Oliver's conception." Madison maintained her composure, though her hands gripped her desk's edge. "Release the standard statement about respecting my late husband's memory and my son's privacy." "There's more," the manager continued hesitantly. "Someone's been asking about your former butler, the one who became a lawyer. They're suggesting dash. Enough." Madison cut him off sharply. "Handle it. That's what we pay you for." The situation escalated when Madison received notice that the Harper Foundation faced a class action lawsuit. The irony didn't escape her. The very social structure she'd sacrificed everything to maintain was now threatening to unravel because of similar prejudices. Her shock turned to something else entirely when she saw the name of the leading attorney, Elijah Bennett. The initial hearing brought them face to face in the courthouse corridor. Madison wore Chanel, her armor against the world. Elijah's suit spoke of success earned rather than inherited. They passed each other without acknowledgement, but both felt the electric current of recognition. "Mrs. Harper," he finally spoke, his voice carrying none of the subservience it once held. "I believe we need to discuss the terms of a potential settlement." The formal tone cut deeper than anger would have. Madison straightened her spine, channeling generations of Harper pride. "My lawyers will be in touch, Mr. Bennett. This case goes beyond individual grievances," he continued, his eyes meeting hers directly. "It's about systematic discrimination within institutions that claim to support equality while perpetuating the very barriers they pretend to deplore." The double meaning in his words hung between them. Madison felt the weight of every lie, every careful omission that had maintained her position in a society that would have rejected her son had she chosen differently. "You've done well for yourself," she managed, gesturing to his briefcase, his suit, his success. "Yes," he replied simply. "I have, despite everything." The unspoken accusations in those 3 words echoed through the marble hallway. Madison watched him walk away, his shoulders straight, his steps confident. He'd transformed himself from the man who used to fade into the background of her life into someone who commanded attention, someone who could destroy everything she'd sacrificed their happiness to protect. The Harper Foundation's conference room crackled with tension. Madison sat at one end of the mahogany table, Elijah at the other. Between them, lawyers arranged papers and whispered strategies, but the real battle raged in the loaded glances between former lovers. "The Foundation's hiring practices clearly show a pattern of discrimination," Elijah stated, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd earned. "Service staff from minority backgrounds are consistently relegated to lower positions, regardless of their qualifications." "That's a gross misrepresentation," Madison countered, though each word felt like ash in her mouth. She knew the truth in his accusations. She'd witnessed it firsthand, had even participated in perpetuating the system that had forced their separation. Unknown to both, Oliver watched through the glass walls of the conference room. At 13, he'd inherited his father's observant nature and his mother's intuition. He noticed the strange current running between them, so different from the professional detachment his mother usually displayed in business meetings. During a break in negotiations, Madison retreated to her private office. Elijah followed, closing the door behind him. "Was any of it real?" he demanded, dropping the professional facade. Or was I just another servant you could dismiss when things got complicated? Madison's fingers trembled as she poured herself water. You know it was real. Every moment was real. Then why? His voice cracked slightly. Why choose this facade over what we had? You know why. Look at what you've accomplished, Elijah. Would you have reached these heights if you'd been branded as the butler who seduced the lady of the house? If you'd been tied to a scandal? That wasn't your choice to make for me, he responded, moving closer. You didn't just deny us a chance. You denied me the right to know my own child. Madison froze, the glass slipping from her fingers. It shattered on the floor, water spreading like the secrets between them. How long have you known? I've always known. Oliver has my mother's eyes, Madison. The same eyes you used to say you loved. Their confrontation was interrupted by a knock. Oliver stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and dawning understanding. He'd heard enough to start piecing together the puzzle of his life. Mom, his voice carried a question she wasn't ready to answer. Madison moved toward her son, but he stepped back. The hurt in his eyes mirrored Elijah's. Oliver, please dash, is it true? He demanded, looking between them. Is he or you? Elijah remained rooted in place, his legal training deserting him in the face of this unplanned revelation. All the carefully crafted arguments about discrimination and justice paled compared to the personal discrimination he'd face. Being denied his own son. Perhaps we should all sit down, Madison suggested, her social training kicking in even as her world tilted on its axis. No, Oliver declared, backing away. I don't want to sit down. I want the truth. For once, I want someone to tell me the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Years of carefully constructed lies teetered on the edge of collapse. Madison looked at Elijah, seeking something, permission, forgiveness, guidance, but found only the same raw hurt she'd seen the day he'd left. The truth, Elijah finally spoke, is complicated. It's really not, Oliver responded, showing wisdom beyond his years. The truth is never as complicated as the lies we tell to avoid it. Madison felt her carefully constructed world crumbling. The society parties, the charitable works, the perfectly maintained image. None of it seemed to matter in the face of her son's disappointment and Elijah's quiet dignity. The legal papers on her desk, the discrimination case that had brought them all to this point, seemed to mock her. She discriminated against her own heart, against Elijah's rights, against Oliver's truth, all in the name of maintaining a social order that suddenly seemed meaningless. Oliver's school life had become a minefield of questions. During lunch period at St. Augustine's Preparatory Academy, his classmates gathered around their usual table, the conversation inevitably turning to family backgrounds. My father's firm just merged with Goldman Sachs, Bradley Thompson boasted, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. What did your father do again, Oliver? Before the accident? Oliver pushed his food around his plate, the lies his mother had taught him sitting heavy on his tongue. He was in finance, he mumbled, the standard response feeling particularly hollow after the scene he'd witnessed at the foundation. Weird though, another classmate chimed in. There's like no pictures of him anywhere online. My mom tried to look him up for some charity thing. The pressure of maintaining the facade was starting to show in Oliver's behavior. His grades slipped, and he withdrew from social activities. Madison received a call from his guidance counselor expressing concern about his sudden change in demeanor. Back at the Harper mansion, Madison paced her study, Elijah's old diary clutched in her hands. She'd found it while clearing out an old storage room, a simple leather-bound book he'd left behind, perhaps intentionally. Her fingers trembled as she read his entries from their time together. Today, M. asked me about my dreams beyond service, one entry read. No one has ever cared to ask before. I told her about law school, about wanting to fight for those society overlooks. She didn't laugh. Instead, she offered to help me study for the LSAT. How strange that I find more support from the lady of the house than from those who claim to champion equality. Another entry, dated just before he left. The baby is showing now. M. thinks no one notices how she touches her stomach when she thinks she's alone. I watch her create this elaborate lie about James, and each word feels like a knife. But what right does a butler have to claim a Harper heir? Perhaps this is for the best. The child will have opportunities one could never provide. Yet every time I serve tea and see her hand rest protective over our secret, I die a little more." Madison sank into her chair, tears falling freely. She convinced herself she was protecting everyone: Oliver from social stigma, Elijah from career suicide, her family from scandal. But reading his private thoughts, seeing the pain she'd caused laid bare on paper, shattered her remaining justifications. The sound of the front door slamming jolted her from her thoughts. Oliver stormed past her study, his school tie askew. "Oliver," she called out. "What happened?" "Someone's father works at the courthouse," he spat back. "They're saying things about you and Mr. B. Net, about why he's really suing the foundation." Madison's heart stopped. "What kind of things? That he used to work here? That he left suddenly when you were pregnant with me?" Oliver's voice cracked. "Is that why there are no real pictures of James Crawford with you? Why every story about him feels rehearsed?" Madison clutched Elijah's diary tighter, the truth sitting heavy on her tongue. But before she could speak, Oliver continued. "Everyone's talking about it. How the great Madison Harper had an affair with the help. How poor Oliver doesn't even know who his real father is." His eyes fell to the diary in her hands. Or maybe he does now. The moment stretched between them, filled with 13 years of lies and half-truths. Madison thought of Elijah's words in the conference room, of his pain and dignity. She thought of all the bedtime stories she'd told Oliver about a father who never existed, while his real father fought to make the world more just. "Sit down, Oliver," she finally said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It's time you knew the truth about your father." She opened the diary, ready to share Elijah's words, his dreams, his love for both of them. But as she looked at her son's hurt expression, she realized that perhaps some truths needed to come from her own heart first. The diary entries could wait. First, she needed to tell her son about a young Butler who loved literature, who dreamed of justice, and who looked at the world with his same thoughtful eyes. The New York Post headline screamed across the morning editions: "Harper heir paternity scandal. Sources question identity of prominent socialite's son." Madison's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from her PR team, board members, and society friends offering support tinged with barely concealed curiosity. In his downtown office, Elijah stared at the article, his legal papers forgotten. His secretary had placed 3 messages from high-profile news outlets on his desk, all requesting comments about his previous employment at the Harper Mansion. The discrimination case had unexpectedly unearthed a far more personal story. Mr. Bennett, his law partner, David Chun, entered without knocking. The Harper Foundation's legal team is requesting an immediate meeting. They're offering to settle the discrimination suit very generously. He paused, studying Elijah's expression. "They're also demanding a non-disclosure agreement about your previous employment there." Elijah looked out his office window at the Manhattan skyline. "They want to buy my silence." "Elijah," David said carefully, "if what these reporters are implying is true, this could compromise our entire case. Personal involvement with the family dash could prove that I have first-hand knowledge of their discriminatory practices," Elijah interrupted. "Or it could destroy my credibility and everything I've built." He picked up the newspaper, Madison's photograph staring back at him. Scheduled the meeting. At the Harper Foundation offices, Madison faced her own crisis. Board members had called an emergency session. Their concerns focused more on stock prices than human dignity. "This scandal isn't just about your personal life anymore, Madison," Thomas Whitmore, the lead director, stated. "The foundation's reputation is at stake. If Bennett is indeed the boy's father, his discrimination suit takes on a whole new dimension." Madison straightened in her chair. The discrimination suit should be addressed regardless of any personal matters. "Personal matters?" Thomas scoffed. "You potentially had a child with a member of the household staff. Every hiring decision, every promotion, every policy we've ever implemented will be scrutinized through that lens." The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message. Elijah had arrived for the settlement discussion, and he was waiting in the conference room. Madison's heart raced as she walked down the corridor. They hadn't spoken since their rotation in her office. The tension in the conference room could have been cut with a knife. Lawyers on both sides arranged their papers while Madison and Elijah sat across from each other, their personal history hanging heavy in the air. Before we begin, Elijah spoke, his voice controlled. "I'd like a moment alone with Mrs. Harper." The lawyers exchanged glances but filed out at Madison's nod. When the door closed, silence filled the room. "The media attention will only get worse," Madison finally said. "I know." Elijah pushed the settlement papers aside. "But that's not why I'm here." Their eyes met across the table, and suddenly they were back in the library, stealing glances between bookshelves. Madison felt the familiar pull, the connection that years and lies hadn't managed to break. Without warning or preamble, Elijah stood and crossed to her side of the table. Madison rose to meet him, and their lips met in a desperate kiss that held 13 years of longing, regret, and unspoken words. When they broke apart, reality came crashing back. Through the glass walls, they could see photographers gathering in the lobby below. Their private moment would soon become tomorrow's headlines. "We can't," Madison whispered, but her hands still gripped his jacket. "We already have," Elijah responded. "The question is, are we going to keep running from it?" The choice lay before them. Continue the charade that had shaped their lives for over a decade, or finally face the truth, regardless of the consequences. In that moment, with the world quite literally watching through the windows, they had to decide if love was worth the cost of social ruin. The settlement papers on the table offered an easy way out: money to make the discrimination suit disappear, agreements to keep their past buried. But they both knew that some truths refused to stay hidden, especially when they wore your eyes and carried your dreams. Oliver stood in the doorway of the conference room, his school uniform rumpled from running past security. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and betrayal at catching his mother and Elijah in their intimate moment. "So it is true," he said, his voice cracking. "Everyone at school is right. It's all been a lie." Madison stepped away from Elijah, but the damage was done. "Oliver, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Oliver's voice rose. "How you've been lying to me my entire life. How my real father has been right here in New York, fighting against the very family I thought I belonged to." Elijah moved forward, his legal training forgotten in the face of his son's pain. "Oliver, the situation is complicated. Stop saying that," Oliver shouted. "Both of you keep saying everything is complicated, but it's not. You're my father. She's my mother. You loved each other. The only complicated thing is all the lies you created to hide it." Security guards appeared behind Oliver, drawn by the commotion. Madison waved them away, closing the conference room door. The three of them stood in a triangle of tension, 13 years of secrets crackling between them. "You're right," Madison finally said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It's time for the truth." "Which version?" Oliver asked bitterly. "The one about James Crawford? Or the one about how the great Madison Harper couldn't admit she loved someone beneath her social status?" Elijah flinched at the words, but Madison stepped forward. "No, the real truth. About how I was a coward. About how I chose social acceptance over love. About how every decision I made thinking I was protecting you actually hurt you more. And you," Oliver turned to Elijah, "you just left? Walked away from your own child." "I left because I thought it would give you both a better life," Elijah responded, his professional facade crumbling. "I left to become someone worthy of Worthy?" Oliver interrupted. "You were already worthy. Mom's the one who couldn't see that." The truth of his word hit Madison like a physical blow. She'd spent years constructing a perfect life based on society's definition of worth, while the real treasure, true love and family, had slipped through her fingers. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself torn between his professional obligations and his personal desires. The discrimination case that had brought him back into their lives now seemed simultaneously more important and completely irrelevant. "The Foundation's practices need to change," he said, looking at Madison. "But perhaps there's a way to make those changes from within, together." Oliver watched this exchange with growing understanding. "So what happens now? We just pretend everything's fine? Go back to our separate lives?" "No," Madison and Elijah spoke simultaneously. They looked at each other, years of unspoken feelings passing between them. No more pretending, Madison continued. No more lies. Whatever happens next, we face it together as a family. If, she looked at Elijah uncertainly, if that's what you both want. The word family hung in the air between them. Oliver, despite his anger, felt a pull toward the father he'd never known. Elijah saw in his son's face the same determination he carried when fighting his way through law school. Madison saw in both of them the chance to finally make right what she'd gotten so wrong. Security buzzed again. Reporters had gathered in the lobby, alerted by Oliver's dramatic entrance. The outside world pressed in, demanding answers, explanations, statements. But in that conference room, three people stood on the verge of becoming what they should have been all along: a family. Together, Elijah repeated, reaching out both hands, one to his son, one to the woman he'd never stopped loving. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The choice lay before them. Continue hiding from the truth, or step into the light and face the consequences as one. The papers on the conference table, both legal and tabloid, waited for their decision. The confession happened in Madison's study, where so many lies had been crafted and maintained over the years. Now, truth filled every corner of the room as Madison formally told Elijah about Oliver's paternity, though it was no longer a revelation. I knew from the moment I saw him in the hospital, Elijah admitted, his voice rough with emotion. He had the same birthmark on his left shoulder that I have, that my father had. Madison watched as tears formed in Elijah's eyes, the usually composed lawyer allowing his walls to crumble. I robbed you of so many firsts, she whispered. His first steps, his first words, his first day of school. Tell me about them, Elijah requested. Tell me everything. They spent hours there, Madison sharing stories of Oliver's childhood, while Elijah listened intently, trying to piece together the years he'd missed. She showed him photographs, school reports, artwork Oliver had made, a lifetime of memories compressed into one emotional evening. Outside the study, Oliver sat on the stairs, listening to his parents' voices mixing together for the first time in his life. The anger that had fueled him earlier began to shift into something more complex, a mixture of hope and fear about what these changes would mean. The following weeks brought awkward attempts at forming family bonds. Elijah began joining them for dinner twice a week. These meals filled with careful conversations and tentative connections. Oliver watched his father cut his meat with the same precise movements he'd inherited, noticed how they both arranged their plates in the same methodical way. You went to Columbia Law School? Oliver asked during one dinner, breaking a lengthy silence. Yes, Elijah responded, grateful for the opening. I started in the evening program while still working as a butler, then transferred to full-time when I left. Left me, you mean? Oliver said, but the words carried more hurt than anger now. Oliver, Madison S.D. Arte, but Elijah raised his hand. Yes, he acknowledged. I left you. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, and not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you both. The honesty in his voice reached something in Oliver. I want to go to Columbia too, he said quietly. I want to be a lawyer like you. The simple statement brought tears to both parents' eyes. Here was their son, a perfect blend of their best qualities, Madison's determination and Elijah's sense of justice. However, the outside world continued to press in. The media camped outside both the Harper Mansion and Elijah's office. Society matrons who had once welcomed Madison now whispered behind their hands at charity events. Oliver's classmates alternated between avoiding him and pestering him with questions. The strain showed in different ways. Madison found herself defending Elijah to her social circle, something she'd never had the courage to do before. Elijah struggled to maintain his professional reputation while navigating his new personal life. Oliver watched it all, understanding for the first time the true cost of love in a world ruled by class and prejudice. Yet amidst the chaos, genuine moments of connection emerged. Elijah helped Oliver with his homework, their heads bent together over textbooks in the library where his parents had first fallen in love. Madison watched them one evening, noting how they shared the same focused expression, the same way of running their hands through their hair when concentrating. He's so much like you, she told Elijah later, as they sat in her study reviewing the latest media coverage of their situation. "He has your spirit," Elijah responded. "Your courage to face adversity." Courage. Madison laughed bitterly. "I hid from the truth for 13 years. And now you're facing it head-on. Consequences be damned. That takes courage, Madison. Different kind of courage, but courage nonetheless." Their relationship began to rebuild itself, not as the secret affair of their youth, but as something more mature, tempered by years of separation and sacrifice. They found themselves rediscovering each other while simultaneously discovering their son together. The process wasn't smooth. There were arguments, tears, moments of doubt. But underneath it all ran a current of rightness, as if the universe was finally correcting a long-standing wrong. The truth, once feared and hidden, began to feel like freedom. The scandal broke like a tsunami across New York's social landscape. The Wall Street Journal published a detailed expose. Harper Foundation, a legacy of discrimination and deception. The article didn't just focus on the discrimination lawsuit. It dug deep into Madison's relationship with Elijah, questioning every promotion, every policy change during his employment. Madison sat in her office, watching her phone light up with calls from board members demanding her immediate resignation. The foundation stock had dropped 15% in a single day. Major donors threatened to pull their support, and partner organizations began distancing themselves. "They're saying you showed preferential treatment," her lawyer explained, spreading newspapers across her desk. "That your relationship with Mr. Bennett compromised hiring decisions. That Oliver's paternity was covered up to protect foundation interests." Elijah faced his own professional crisis. The New York Bar Association launched an ethics inquiry, questioning whether his personal connection to the Harper family should have been disclosed before taking the discrimination case. "Your career is at stake," his law partner warned. "They're suggesting you pursued the case for personal revenge rather than justice." Meanwhile, Oliver discovered a new article online. Harper heir, born of scandal, raised on lies. His classmates shared it relentlessly, adding cruel comments and mocking memes. The prestigious St. Augustine's Preparatory Academy's headmaster suggests a temporary withdrawal until the situation stabilizes. The pressure mounted when Elijah received an unexpected ultimatum from his firm's senior partners. "Either drop the Harper case and publicly distance yourself from Madison and the boy, or clean out your office," they demanded. "We can't have our firm's reputation tainted by this scandal." Elijah stood in his office, looking at the law degrees he'd worked so hard to earn, the awards he'd won fighting for justice. Now he faced losing everything he'd built. Madison received similar pressure from the foundation's board. "Step down gracefully," they advised. "Let us handle the discrimination suit. Take Oliver somewhere abroad until this blows over." But Oliver, showing a strength inherited from both parents, made a decision that changed everything. During a particularly heated foundation board meeting, he burst into the conference room. "You can't make my mother resign," he declared, his voice steady despite his age. "And you can't pretend this discrimination isn't real. I've watched it my whole life. How you treat people like my father, how you hide behind policies and traditions to keep people down." The board members sat stunned as this 13-year-old boy laid bare their hypocrisy. But Oliver wasn't finished. "My father worked his way up from being a butler to becoming one of New York's top civil rights lawyers. My mother built this foundation into something that could actually help people, instead of destroying them. Maybe you should listen to what they have to say." Madison, watching her son stand up for both his parents, felt years of shame fall away. She stood up, moved to Oliver's side, and faced the board. "My son is right," she said. "I've spent years maintaining a system I knew was wrong. If you want my resignation because I fell in love with a man society deemed beneath me, fine. But don't pretend this is about anything other than your own prejudices." Elijah, who had been called to the meeting to discuss settlement terms, found himself witnessing his son's courage and Madison's transformation. The discrimination case, his career, the scandal, all of it seemed to shift into new perspective. But just as they appeared to be uniting as a family, fate dealt another blow. A reporter uncovered information about Elijah's own background. Information that would shake the foundations of not just the Harper family, but New York society itself. The revelation sat in a sealed envelope on Madison's desk, delivered by a journalist seeking comment before publication. The truth inside would either destroy them completely or transform their personal scandal into something far more explosive. The Wellington Hotel's grand ballroom buzzed with New York's elite attending the annual Foundation Gala. The same event where Madison had first announced her pregnancy 13 years ago now became the stage for another life-changing moment. Oliver stood at the podium, his young voice carrying across the silent room. "My name is Oliver Bennett Harper, and it's time you all knew the truth about who I am." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Madison and Elijah stood at opposite ends of the room, their hearts racing as their son continued. "For 13 years, you've told me who I should be. The heir to the Harper fortune, the son of a dead financier, a symbol of old money and tradition. But I'm actually something else. I'm the son of a man who worked his way from servant to civil rights lawyer, and a woman who finally found the courage to choose love over society's expectations." Cameras flashed as reporters captured every word. But the true bombshell was yet to come. A man rose from the audience. George Wellington III, Madison's father's oldest rival and one of New York's most powerful patriarchs. His face had grown pale during Oliver's speech. "That's enough," Wellington commanded, but Oliver held his ground. "No, it's not enough," Oliver continued, pulling out an old photograph. "Because there's one more truth that needs to be told. The reason Mr. Wellington has spent years trying to destroy the Harper Foundation. The reason he's been leaking information to the press about my parents." Madison stepped forward, the sealed envelope from her desk now open in her hands. "Your father wasn't just a butler when he worked for us, was he, Elijah? He was George Wellington's illegitimate son, sent to work in our household to hide the scandal." The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Elijah moved to stand beside his son, facing his biological father for the first time with full knowledge of their connection. "You sent your own son to work as a servant," Elijah stated, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "And when he fell in love with Madison Harper, you did everything in your power to separate us, to protect your secret." George Wellington's face contorted with rage and shame. "You have no proof, Dash. Actually, we do," Madison interrupted, her voice steady. "Your letters to Elijah's mother. The trust fund you set up in his name under a shell corporation. The private investigators you hired to track his law school progress. A father's pride wrapped in shame and secrecy." Oliver looked between his parents and the man who was technically his grandfather. "So you see," he addressed the crowd, "this isn't just about discrimination and hiring practices or a scandal about who loves whom. It's about generations of lies, of people being pushed down and kept silent to maintain an illusion of propriety." The truth hung in the air like crystal chandeliers above them, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Madison took Elijah's hand, no longer caring who saw. "The foundation will be restructured," she announced to the stunned audience, "with a new board of directors focused on actual equality, not just the appearance of it. And yes, Elijah Bennett, my son's father, George Wellington's son, and the man I have always loved, will help lead that change." The aftermath was both better and worse than they'd expected. Some donors withdrew, but others, younger and more progressive, stepped forward. The discrimination lawsuit was settled with real policy changes, not just monetary compensation. St. Augustine's Preparatory Academy found itself revising its own policies after several alumni threatened to withdraw funding over their treatment of Oliver. Months later, Madison, Elijah, and Oliver sat in their library, the same room where their story began. The press had finally tired of their story. Society had largely adjusted to the new normal, and they were learning to be a family. "Was it worth it?" Oliver asked, looking up from his homework. "All the chaos, the changes, the truth coming out?" Madison and Elijah exchanged glances, their hands intertwined. The answer came from both of them, simultaneously, yes. Because in the end, their story wasn't just about love conquering social barriers. It was about the courage to face truth, the strength to change broken systems, and the power of family. not the kind defined by society, but the kind built on love, honesty, and the bravery to be who you really are.